Thank you very much. I'm going to see if I can get my PowerPoint to load quickly. Voila. So, thank you first of all for that extremely kind introduction. And although I was introduced as a political geographer, I'll be masquerading as a historical one today. But jokes aside, thank you so much for inviting me to come here and share some of my thoughts and actually work in progress with you. Thanks to Adrian, of course, and the board of the journal, and also to you and the rest of the local organizers for providing us with really an exceptional context for this meeting. And of course, Crete, and Hania, I didn't need to tell you this, is exceptional not just in its beauty, but also, as Vasily pointed out, because of a very long and complex history, which I think can teach us many things about some of the things happening in Europe today as well. Crete, as you well know, has laid a crossroads of both, as you said, East and West, but also North and South for centuries. And I wanted to start you out with a couple of actually historical maps of Venetian Crete to get us to think about some of these connections and think about what some of these histories can perhaps teach us in a moment in which some, perhaps too many Europeans seem to be struggling with the dealing with some of the changes that Europe is being faced with. And I say some because I don't want to extend that, and I really look forward to hearing a lot of the presentations which are dealing precisely with that. The reason I want to start you out with some maps of Venetian Crete is also because it allows me to make a connection to a research project that I'm just starting right now on Venice's own relations with the East, and not only the East, with lands further afield. A project that actually thinks, hopefully very geographically, this is a map from the Venetian map of the 16th century of Canea or Hania. The project that I'm referring to looks at the ways in which Venice envisioned these relations, not just, of course, in terms of geographical representations, and there's a ton of work on Venetian cartography and not only, but the ways in which it built these relationships literally into its urban spaces. And those of you who have been to Venice will recognize this as a portion of what is called the Moor Square. But also other ways in which these connections appeared in the Venetian landscape, whether through the looting of various spolia, such as these bronze horses that still adorn the Basilica of St. Mark that came back from Constantinople as part of the spoils of the Fourth Crusade in 1204, or slightly more ennobled forms of looting, such as the famous story of the translatio, the translation of the body of St. Mark from Alexandria to Venice, that was meant to mark somehow Venice's taking on the mantle of both Eastern and Western Christianity and mark it as the spiritual inheritor to Byzantium. And this is a painting by Tintoretto that hangs in the Galleria dell'Accademia that was commissioned already at a moment when Venice's power in the Eastern Mediterranean was waning, so in a sense, a way of affirming that power. But apart from these historical connections that actually walking around Hania in the past day really came to my mind, the reason I want to bring your minds back to Venice is because I want to recommend to you an event that took place in Venice last year as part of the 2015 Venice Art Biennale, one of the most important events in the contemporary art circuit, and one that I think can tell us something, at least, about some of the reactions against difference in European cities today. especially what I want to draw our attention to is how this episode, I think, is emblematic of the ways in which fear of Muslim presence in Europe is becoming what I believe we can see as almost fetish. A fetish because it is at once removed entirely from its referent and at the same time all-encompassing, totalizing. It is a fetish because it provokes what anthropologist Michael Fisher, who was writing this at the time of the Danish Muhammad controversies already over a decade ago, provokes what he called an emotional excess. And I think thinking of the idea of the fetish is useful both academically, theoretically, but also politically, for a number of reasons. Because I think it allows us to understand some of what is happening, but also to hopefully depotentiate it, to strip away the power of this fetish in contemporary populist politics, and unfortunately also in politics of the non-populist variety. Now, I'm not the only one to use this term, and in fact, this idea of thinking of the fetish I steal from a colleague of mine, Andreas Mann, who co-wrote a piece together with me and a number of other people, including some in this room, a few years ago. This notion has been used also by Emmanuel Perret, who wrote in the moment of the first set of headscarf debates in France. It would be interesting to think of what he would make of the burkini controversies. But what I'd like to add to some of those ideas is how space, and urban spaces in particular, work with this idea of fetishization. So let me mention Perret, who was writing over a decade ago precisely about the headscarf ban. He published an essay, actually, on New Left Review in 2004, entitled Headscarf Hysteria. Many of you may be familiar with it. And in this essay, he draws actually on the work of Hungarian historian István Biko, who was writing about the interwar period and the role of the fetish in that moment. And this is what Perret writes, drawing on Biko. When a community fails to find within itself the means or energy to deal with a problem that challenges, if not its existence, then at least its way of being and self-image, it will be tempted to adopt a particular defensive ploy. It will substitute a fictional problem, which can be mediated purely through words and symbols, for the real one, which it finds insurmountable. In grappling with the former, the community can convince itself that it has successfully confronted the latter. It experiences a sense of relief and thus feels itself able to carry on as before. And this power of substitution that he identifies, I want us to keep this in mind, because I think it is very important when we start thinking about how the fear of Muslim presence in Europe today is working itself out. So, through this power of substitution, and again, I'm saying things that many people have said before and probably more convincingly, the fetish is able to gather into itself everything. It is no longer about a specific individual, or set of individuals, a specific set of acts, but rather it becomes about religion with a capital R, civilization with a capital C in the kind of unfortunate Huntingtonian sense. And since it becomes a fetish, the reaction is to destroy it, to remove it, to eliminate it, or at least eliminate it from view, giving that sense of relief that Perret writes about. And using this idea of the fetish, I didn't want to discount in any way the various also violent reactions across Europe today to the presence of Muslim communities, and especially migrant communities. But I want us to start thinking about, hopefully, what other ways we have of addressing this. So you have been looking at the slide, and those of you who read Italian or can guess what it means will probably have guessed what episode I'm alluding to. Because what I want to do in the time that I have is tell you the story of the mosque, written in capital letters, which was the Icelandic contribution to the Venice Biennale of 2015. An exhibit that lasted only 2 weeks, for it says 10 days, rather than the usual run of 5 months, because it was shut down by the local authorities in Venice, citing public health and safety reasons. When the exhibit was introduced in the local press, it was presented quite directly as, quote, a visual analog of a mosque. Okay? Unfortunately for the organizers, the installation became something else as the local Muslim community began using it as a site of prayers and gathering. An all-too-real performance, apparently, that brought the exhibit's forcible closure. So the mosque was the work of Swiss artist Christoph Büchel, who's quite well known for his, let's say, hyper-realistic installations. He had created a fake real community centre in London called the Piccadilly Community Centre in 2011, and most recently, actually this year, he was setting up a supermarket in Düsseldorf that also did not go ahead so far. For the Venetian installation, Büchel chose the deconsecrated church of the Santa Maria della Misericordia in the Canereggio district of Venice, and you see it here. Within the 2 weeks of the exhibit's operation, this was in early May, so from the opening of the Biennale on the 8th until the 22nd, this white Baroque facade that you see here of this deconsecrated church gave no indication of what lay inside. Unlike some of the other events of the Biennale that had taken over various sites in Venice, various palaces and so on, there was no sign outside marking it as a Biennale event. So only when you kind of entered inside, and apologies for this bad picture, I had gone there on the 21st of May, the day before it was forcibly shut down, just snapping some pictures with the intention of coming back with a proper camera, and of course it did not happen. So only when you went inside you could see kind of small inscription on the door saying, Centro Culturale Islamico di Venezia, so Venetian Islamic Center, the Mosque of the Misericordia. As you entered inside, a set of flyers announced the exhibit, describing it as co-organized by the Muslim community of Venice, with a little map tracing the route from the train station. And actually, the interesting thing also about these flyers is that looking at them, you could not really perceive that this was once more an exhibit. The only kind of clue to that lay the curious IS extension on the website for the project, revealing that this was somehow linked to the Islamic exhibition. Once inside this space of the deconsecrated church, what was to be a, quote, visual analog of a mosque was set up, with the main interior space resembling that of a mosque prayer hall with a prayer carpet and the usual attributes of a mosque, including a mihrab niche indicating the director of Mecca, a minbar from which the imam could address the congregation, and so on. So here are some pictures of what this exhibit looks like. In a room to the side, there was also a small kind of information center that included pamphlets and various prayer paraphernalia and a little space for consulting it. And during the day of my visit, there were quite a few people milling inside. It was very hard to tell if these were actually Biennale patrons. You did not require a ticket to go in, or just people attracted by all the publicity that this exhibit generated. At the same time, this was one of the pamphlets about what is Islam produced in the prayer paraphernalia area. And at the same time, inside the mosque, there was, or the mosque to be, and you will pardon my slippage because it was a very kind of willing slippage, there was a delimitation of the prayer space in which a number of people were. And it was precisely this delimitation of the to-be religious space, let me just get it back here, okay, let's have the sign of the no shoes beyond this point, that was used as a pretext for the first protest against the mosque by local opponents, who lodged a formal complaint with the city's authorities within literally just a day of the installation's opening, noting that since the mosque was not a recognized place of worship, rules pertaining to places of worship could not be enforced. And the shoe question became a particular rallying point, with several protesters attempting to enter the space in shoes, to see what, quote, these people can do to us, as one particularly feisty woman from the neighborhood told the Italian newspaper La Repubblica. And of course, nothing would happen, since once more this was an exhibit, and the suggestions that were provided there of removing your shoes or, for example, putting on a veil were just part of the performance. Now, there are over 20,000, perhaps more, Muslims who work and live in Venice and in the area, and who for 15 years have been campaigning to have a site for prayers without having to travel to the mainland for over an hour to reach the closest mosque there. And so the project was thought up by the artist, by Christoph Büchel, in collaboration with the Venetian Islamic community, to answer in part their need for a gathering space. At the same time, Büchel wanted to allude to Venice's very important connections with the Orient, with the East and the Middle East. And let me switch back here. Connections that, again, I think speaking here from Hania, I think we can think of quite fruitfully. Venice, whose power at its height stretched across the Adriatic and the Mediterranean, and for centuries was Europe's gate to the Orient, a key interchange point for both goods and ideas. And the painting that I wanted to show you here is Gentile Bellini's painting of the Venetian ambassadors arriving in Damascus. It hangs today in the Louvre, and I think Bellini was in many ways one of Venice's court painters, and I think a great kind of example of some of the ways in which the Republic envisioned these connections. Now, the city, as I said today, in its built environment is still very much a testament to that, whether in the Byzantine-influenced or directly looted bits of architecture, or kind of the traces such as the Moor that I showed you in one of my first slides, but also in the very landscape of some of its most famous sites, such as St. Mark's Square, which, before it was widened in the 16th century, was modeled directly on the courtyard of the Great Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. And I think it's important to remember, particularly today, these shared urban histories and geographies, to think that Venice and Damascus were once part of the very same Mediterranean world and learned from and inspired one another. Today it's important to remember that at a moment where we tend to very much fetishize difference and to also distance those arriving at Europe's borders. But these connections were not the ones that the opponents of the mosque wanted to see made visible in Venice's landscape. Led by local politicians from the far-right and separatist Lega Nord and the Fratelli d'Italia party, pickets began outside of the installation the day of its opening, saying once more this is an unauthorized place of worship that should be closed. But the interesting thing to my mind was the very so-called citizens' initiatives that did not focus on the legal question of the right to function of a space of worship, but rather questioning its connection to the city space. And I'll show you one such leaflet that was put up by the citizens' committees right in front of the installation. And this is what it proclaimed, and you can see that there's a problem here with the flag. This is what it says. Iceland, as part of the 2015 Venice Biennale, created a mosque in the Church of Santa Maria della Misericordia, violating and desecrating a symbol of our Christianity, culture, and historical memory. Not true, the church has been desecrated since 1973. Doesn't matter. Let us all stand up to this offensive and provocative act by a nation that appears to have still remained barbarian. Boycott all of their products and tourist business. Do not buy any made in Iceland products, or in the case of fish, any with the label fish or raised in the North Sea. Now, the flyers, as you see, featured prominently in the center what was meant to be the Icelandic flag. Unfortunately, the flag was not an Icelandic flag, but British, and drew all kinds of stares and snickers from tourists passing by. Now, the other set of flyers was even more interesting to my mind. Unfortunately, they had all been vandalized when I tried to take a picture, and alluded to a different set of imagined urban geographies and histories, featuring the Madonna di Nicopea. Again, an interesting connection. It's an icon that hangs in St. Mark's Basilica, having arrived in Venice also as part of the spoils of the Fourth Crusade, looted from Constantinople, but now suddenly a symbol of Western Christianity. As legend has it, Venetians have been particularly devoted to the Madonna since then, and the icon is said to have protected the city from war and pestilence. And I'll read you just part of the text of the appeal in the flyer. Santa Vergine Nicopea, we as your children afflicted by this sacrilegious profanation of your monastery, as in the past for the struggle against pestilence and wars of self-preservation, pray to you, O beacon of victory, take up the prayer of your people, confirm their faith, and sustain their hope, protect your church in this hour of need. Now, appeals to divine protection against profanation are not, unfortunately, new in the Veneto or in Italian politics. And they are in many ways instantly recognizable to the Italian public, for they draw on a much longer set of imaginaries promoted by the Lega but also other parties, focused on the threat of a putative Muslim invasion of Europe, decried as Eurabia. And many of these appeals, starting already over a decade ago, have engaged language and geographical imaginations lifted directly out of the Crusades, with some pundits like Oriana Fallaci prognosticating an Islamic reverse crusade that threatens to submerge and subjugate Europe. Now, I mention this because it's important to remember these genealogies today when various political figures across Europe, whether Orban in Hungary or the Kaczynskis in Poland, or one Kaczynski left right now, both invoke these sorts of crusading metaphors. When, for example, even negotiating migration quotas with the European Union, appealing to the need to protect Europe and Europeans against pestilence and disease. This is also present, unfortunately, in Dutch politics. And I want to make this point that this disease, the disease of populism, unfortunately, is Europe-wide, and I think it's very important to avoid drawing false distinctions of a different sort across the continent, kind of separating the presumably intolerant and racist East from the very tolerant and open West, because that's certainly not the case, and these crusading metaphors have, unfortunately, saliency across. But let's return to how these protection narratives were invoked in the case of the mosque. It was, in fact, not the need to protect the Venetian public from an undefined pestilence, but something akin to it, that became the excuse to shut down the installation. When the local authorities, the Venetian authorities, intervened to forcibly shut it was not due to violation of religious or cultural sensibilities, or even the lack of a permit for a proper place of worship. The Venice Procura announced that the mosque would be shut down for, quote, public health reasons, citing sanitary and fire safety regulations. So applying regulations that usually govern real spaces of worship, public gathering spaces, and so on. And the collage of photographs that you see here from the local newspaper, La Nuova, kind of is a perfect embodiment of that. So showing the teeming space of the mosque that happened only one day, the day of its opening. But also, as a particular offense, a pair of socks hanging of what was once the holy water font. So the mosque, in many ways, became a fetish to be destroyed, gathering into it a much longer set of prejudices, fears, and fears, presumably, that with installation's closure were partially, at least, assuaged. And since public authorities cannot speak directly the language of fetish, the appeal was to the language of public health and public safety. Now, the episode that I'm recounting to you today is in some ways unique because the contest over the presence of an Islamic space pertained to a fake space, not a real space of worship, which I think is precisely why it's so revealing of the fetish-like nature that's granted to Muslim spaces and Muslim bodies in European cities today. Because even though it was not real, it was an artistic performance, it produced a very real emotional excess, a very real set of popular and political reactions. And in many ways, this story, the story of the Venetian mosque, reflects many similar contexts across Europe over the building of real mosques, whether in Italy or elsewhere. So we can think, of course, of the Swiss referendum in 2009, in Italy, long-running challenge in the Lombardy region, currently governed also by the Lega, to impose a ban on mosque construction, but also proposals by the AfD in Germany and also in Austria. So in Venice right now, right across from the airport on the mainland in Pescara, the airport that's appropriately named after famed explorer of the Orient Marco Polo, a new mosque is being built. And most of the debates have centered precisely on its size and visibility. As long as it's an inconspicuous structure that's going to blend in into the surrounding peri-urban countryside of car dealerships, no one will complain, quote, as one observer on the local paper put it. And this is very interesting and reflects very much what other colleagues working on similar debates have noted. Invisible Islamic spaces, so what are usually called storefront mosques that occupy mundane buildings, have not aroused the same sorts of reactions that purpose-built mosques have, precisely because they're spatially inconspicuous. Although, and this is important to know, such attitudes have shifted considerably in the past couple of years, because it is the hidden, informal mosques that have now become a marker of potential security concerns. And I don't have time to address this here, but here we're talking about another new set of potentially fetishized geographies of the enemy within, and whether, we're talking about Belgian, French, Dutch, or Danish cities, there's a powerful set of understandings of urban spaces that really calls for our critical attention. How am I doing on time, Adrian? Badly. No. So, in closing, I want to return to some of these securitizing narratives, very strongly fetishized, and especially geographical imaginations of the need to protect European cities and European bodies from this putative Muslim threat. And I wanted to show you some horrible cartoons because they have precisely this much longer historical genealogy, where appeals to protection against threat and putative Islamic invasion have a long legacy in Italy. These cartoons, this one and the next one that I'll show you, come from pamphlets being distributed 15 years ago by the Lega Nord on their annual Padania Day celebrations in Venice. Now, we unfortunately recognize these racialized depictions here, but they're come back with a vengeance into the European public imaginary in the past months. And these two covers, this one is from a Polish magazine that says the Islamic rape of Europe, and this one is from a German magazine, again, to avoid drawing false distinctions and racisms across Europe, also with a similar kind of symbolic message. Appeal to that very same logic of protection, with now the safety of our streets, but not only, actually specifically the safety of European women's bodies being invoked as a security imperative. Now, both these magazine covers speak to the aftermath of the criminal events in Cologne, and that's exactly what they were. They were criminal events. But of course, the reaction to them, I think, speaks perfectly to this notion of the kind of fetish-like workings of the fear of Muslim presence. Now, the expansion of the catalogue of potential dangers posed to Europeans in European cities by large-scale migration from the Muslim world in the spring of 2016 expanded its reach. So the refugee as potential terrorist is now also the refugee as potential rapist, molester, and abductor of European women, tracing a very clear geography of who is to be feared and whose presence is to be vigilated upon in city streets. And I wanted to show you this. This is also from 15 years ago, from the Lega flyers in 2001, because just as the magazine covers that I just showed you from Poland and Germany, it constitutes a very particular set of geographical distinctions in urban space. So kind of setting up who are the good men who protect their women and children in relation to the bad men liable to attack. And of course, these geographical imaginations are not new. I mean, they draw upon a very long legacy of colonial imaginations, but also a more recent legacy in the War on Terror, commented upon by countless people, including Judith Butler, who talks about how women's freedom and safety is being used to wage cultural war against Islam. So, to really close, how do we respond? I don't want to leave that image on any longer than I have to. How can we respond academically, but also politically, to these narratives? How can we depotentiate them? A growing body of work by geographers, by anthropologists, other urban scholars, has been looking at the effective geographies generated by Islamic spaces and Islamic bodies, including the work of several colleagues in this room, such as Kirsten Simonson and her colleagues. And this research, I think, has been very important in drawing out precisely the sort of emotional excess that the presence of Islamic sites and bodies and objects provokes in the spaces of European cities. So what could be the alternative? Now, in the opening of my talk, I alluded to some of the histories of the Venetian Empire and its very particular brand of, let's say, what is now being called pre-colonial colonialism, that very ably incorporated symbolically as well as materially a variety of Mediterranean others into its self-representation and strategies of rule. In saying this, though, in no way do I want to suggest the Venetian model as a guide, because Venice's rule over the Mediterranean was, in many ways, fully colonial, and a trip to whether the Maritime Museum here in Hania or actually several of the churches will tell you that quite directly. So that's in no way my intent, because I think it would be equally dangerous as invoking other romanticized visions of more recent Mediterranean cosmopolitan pasts in which cities like Alexandria, Beirut, Istanbul, Izmir, Thessaloniki, or Hania were somehow idyllic places of linguistic and religious coexistence. And great scholar of the Cretan past, Michael Herzfeld, has warned for many decades against this under his rubric of Mediterraneanisms. But, and here I really want to close, these pasts of even, yes, very unequal co-presence can hold some lessons, because co-presence and visibility, again, even if not fully equitable, do matter. Certainly, the relationship between visibility and physical presence in spaces and political inclusion is in no way direct. Visibility and presence don't equal political recognition, and in fact, forced visibility of the sort that is being let's say, placed upon many recent migrants has the opposite effect. And I'm thinking here of the writings of Hannah Arendt on the condition of the refugee here, where she argues that refugees are both made wrongfully invisible and wrongfully visible at the same time. And I think a lot of people writing on the illegalization of migration in Europe today make that exact point of this kind of pathologies of visibility and invisibility. So how can artistic, we have some more Venetian images here, artistic interventions such as the mosque hold an emancipatory potential in this sense? The curator of this year's or last year's Biennale, Ohuy Mbezor, noted that politically successful artistic interventions are those that, quote, disturb the spatial coordinates of contemporary dwelling in place and re-articulate the ethical confrontation between the stranger and the neighbor, making space for a temporary autonomous zone of encounters. And here he's using Hakim Bey's idea. But also I think that echoes very nicely Andy Merrifield's notion of urban spaces of encounter. The mosque in Venice, in some ways, did achieve precisely that. It made space for a confrontation between the stranger and the neighbor, just not exactly the kind of ethical confrontation that Mbezor envisioned. It did create a public space of encounter, just not of the emancipatory kind. So the question that I want to leave you with, and one that I think a lot of the presentations in this conference will actually address, is how can we actually make space also for other conversations, create other spaces of encounter that are not delimited by the sort of emotional excesses of nativist and anti-immigrant politics. We can't presume that such spaces of encounter will be unproblematic, and this is perhaps what the histories of Mediterranean cities can teach us, where we can actually move away from equally totalizing and fetishizing notions of idyllic urban coexistence. Colleagues like Lynn Staley and Rachel Payne and others who've been writing from the perspective of what they call intimacy geopolitics remind us of something that I think is very important in this, noting that all spatial relations that bring together the proximate and the distant, the familiar and the unfamiliar, always entangle a diversity of emotional responses and geographies. Some charitable, some much less so, evoking trust but also fear, well-meaning curiosity but also bigotry. And so I would like to close by saying that I think we need to make space in European cities today also for such non-ideal spaces of encounter that bring together all their range of emotional geographies. And we desperately need such complicated, also complicated spaces, even temporary, to disrupt some of these totalizing politics of exclusion that increasingly fetishizes the fear of Muslim presence. So I will end there, and sorry to have run over time.